right, my beautiful learners. Apologies for not getting out the enrichment activity last week. I spent way too much time doing Romeo and Juliet recap videos when I should have probably been working harder on this, which is actually turned into like kind of a labor of love. It's an idea that I'm exploring. It's the final enrichment activity that will be mandated for you. I'll probably keep putting these things out just for anyone who's at all interested, if nothing else than just to keep my mind sharp and maybe stock up on activities in the possibility that we won't have the school year starting up at the normal time next year. So that brings us to what I really want to talk about, the thing that I've been working on for the last 2 weeks. It's actually a comparative sort of like fleshing out of ideas between one very old short story, The Lady or the Tiger, which used to be a classic and taught in every freshman reader. I can remember it being in mine. It used to be in the one that we used at Central, but since has kind of followed its author on its way out of existence in the popular consciousness. And a very recent short story, which I see as a response to or a fleshing out of the ideas of The Lady or the Tiger, a short story called Cinnamon by one of my favorite authors, a guy by the name of Neil Gaiman. So he's a contemporary writer still alive today. The other guy, dead for a really long time. His work's fading in popularity, but I think the ideas that are explored in both of these stories are incredibly important, especially for us now as we prepare to enter this new world and we ask ourselves, what are we going to do with it? A lot of times fiction can get us closer to the truth than the truth can. So let's go ahead. We'll break down. First, we'll start off talking about what you need to know in order to understand the comparison and what makes these stories so interesting and special. And then we'll talk about maybe what they mean and hopefully you can find a way that it applies to your existence today. All right, so let's talk about Frank R. Stockton. Now, you may not have heard of him, but he's an important guy to know, at least an interesting one to know. Not only was he possessed of one of the greatest mustaches of all time, but he was also an incredibly popular author during his lifetime. They used to say about Americans that the only two Americans every European knew were Jesse James and Mark Twain. Now, one of those guys was a bank robber, the other one was an author. This guy was second in popularity to Mark Twain. All right, so he was a pretty big deal during his life. He wrote prolifically. He's filled up tons and tons and tons of pages with words, and yet today almost nobody knows who he is, and the people who do know him only know him for one short story that he wrote, the one that we're going to talk about, The Lady or the Tiger. Now, the thing that makes The Lady or the Tiger so comment worthy, so remarkable, is what he does with the conventions of storytelling. Now, from the beginning of your freshman year, we drilled into you guys like 5-point plot diagram. How does this break down? How can we use this to understand and anticipate what happens in stories that we read? Stockton, especially in this story, was remarkable for how he played with the reader's expectations in terms of how he used it to create art. The closest thing I can think of in terms of a comparison is the Quentin Tarantino movie, Death Proof. If you haven't seen Death Proof, it is a hard R rated and it's not a particularly great movie, but it plays with our conventions of a horror movie. Everyone knows more or less what happens in a horror movie, and from the second the movie starts rolling, we all start going through our mental checklist of what character is going to die and who's going to die first. And okay, so here's the blonde girl who's engaging in promiscuous activity. Well, she's clearly going to die. And oh, here's a black character. Well, they'll never make it to the end of the movie. When Tarantino did Death Proof, he did a really interesting thing halfway through the movie to completely blow up all of his audience's preconceived understandings and mental machinations about what was going to happen to the characters in that story. I won't spoil it for you, but what good artists sometimes do is not only do they work within the conventions of storytelling, but sometimes when they know what the audience expectation is for that convention, they can subvert that expectation in a meaningful way and thus make art that is more meaningful and more important than anything that checks all of the boxes for conventional storytelling. All right, it's been turned into a bunch of, his story, The Lady of the Tiger, has been turned into a bunch of different media. It's still an important story in terms of a cultural touchstone, in terms of knowing what you know. And I think that's part of why Gamian, in his story Cinnamon, is, in my opinion, referencing it so strongly. We'll talk more about what all this means as we progress. Okay, so the storytelling convention that the author subverts in The Lady or the Tiger, and I would argue in Cinnamon as well, is what we anticipate based on our knowledge of typical dramatic plot structures. Unconsciously or consciously, because we've had it hammered into us by the time we're 15 years old, we all know what the plot structure of a story should be. We know that in the beginning we'll begin with the exposition, and this will tell us the setting and the characters and the conflict. And once we know what that conflict is, that's going to lead us into the rising action, the series of events that build up to the climax, the highest action or emotional point of the story, wherein there is a turning point for the main characters from which they will never be the same. After that, there's a falling action in which they deal with the results of that climax. And then finally, a resolution where the conflict that was initially encountered is in some way, shape, or form dealt with. So knowing that his audience knew the conventions of dramatic plot structure, our author Stockton does a really interesting thing in The Lady or the Tiger. Let's do some background building first, and then we'll get to it. So between these two stories, you actually see some pretty strong parallels in terms of setting, the time and place where it happens, in terms of characters, the people who are involved, and even the problems that these characters face to some extent are very, very similar. All right, and what's interesting is the way the authors both use these similar tools in order to try to make us think about something way bigger than these abstract fairy tales that they tell us, something that could be much more interesting when applied to our own personal lives. In particular, the conflicts that are faced by the characters in each of these stories are noteworthy. Now, almost every story should have some sort of conflict. If it doesn't, then what is the purpose of this story? There are two types of conflict that I feel like I didn't do a great job of addressing earlier this year with any of my classes, so let's go ahead and rehash this for anybody who's interested. There are two types of conflict. There's the external conflict where the main character is fighting with something outside of themselves, be it nature, society, fate, some other character. These conflicts are the obvious ones. There are internal conflicts as well, all right, where you're torn between two different courses of actions, where you're torn between conflicting choices or conflicting loyalties. Do I kill the man who's going to become emperor for the good of democracy, or do I not because he's my friend and I like him? Do I go against my family wishes and try to love this person, or do I do what society tells me to do? Do I do the right thing and take care of my house guest, or do I murder them so that I can become king? All these things can be internal conflict, and ultimately I think, honestly, the most interesting conflicts are the internal ones. External conflicts always tend to devolve into good guy versus bad guy, and while there's a great place for that in storytelling, the things that gives us true meaningful insight into ourselves, it's always going to be the internal stuff. The internal life is always what makes the external life meaningful. Okay, so before we get started, and you guys can drop these down into the comment section, and then we can all have a chance to read them. You can do it anonymously. It's not a big deal, or put your name on it and put yourself out there and be brave, one way or the other. Just discuss a time in your life where you were caught kind of between a rock and a hard place in terms of a dilemma or a quandary. This is almost always going to be some sort of an internal conflict that you had to face. All right. Could be a situation in which neither choice seemed particularly right. It could be a situation in which it seemed like it was a no-win situation. What decision did you make, and why did you choose it? And the thing that we're going to talk about here is the lesser of two evils. So This is a classic philosophical concept that an old school philosopher came up with, that when faced with what seems like an unwinnable situation, we should always choose the lesser of two evils, whatever will be the least destructive, the least hurtful to ourselves and others. That ultimately is the right choice when we're faced with these types of conflicts. How did you determine what your lesser of two evils was, and how did that work out for you? All right, so just off the top of my head, if I was going to give you an example, I'll throw it back to when I was in high school. Sure, this will come as a shock to some of you, but yes, your teacher, when he was in high school, was in fact arrested. Yeah, true story. I was arrested for minor in possession of alcohol. So this was when I lived in New Mexico, and it was my junior year of high school, and I got invited to a party, and I was there, and there was drinking going on at the party. There's no doubt about that, but I didn't drink at this time, and honestly, I don't drink now. I tried it. It wasn't really something that flipped my switch, and so being a teetotaler is not a problem. And I wasn't particularly interested at that point in my life. So I was sitting on the top couch doing what I thought I should do at a party, which is try to steal the girlfriend of the guy who was already too drunk to handle her. And in the process, I did not notice that the police had arrived, and they come through the door, and everybody who was drinking, who knew they were guilty, like got up and as a mass just bolted out the back door, side door, windows. They all got out of the house and sprinted for the desert, because we were in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, but they all took off, and none of them got caught. Your English teacher, who was not drinking, stayed sitting on the couch, because my rationale at the time was, why should I run? I haven't been doing anything wrong. I was really naive. I thought that not doing anything wrong actually protected you from the law. I found out as I was being arrested that the New Mexico statute for minor in possession of alcohol at the time read that any minor in possession or with access to alcohol was in violation of that code. So I got arrested, and then my parents had to come and pick me up, much to my great shame, shock, and humiliation. In that situation, I thought running was the greater of two evils, because it made me look guilty when I wasn't. Because if I did get caught, then they could add on something like resisting arrest or some other foolish thing. And so I thought the lesser of two evils was just hanging back and just being like, what's good? I'm not doing anything wrong. You can go ahead and arrest whoever you want to. I'm not really part of this scene. Well, I ended up having to go to teen court and do quite a few hours of community service because of that choice, but that's the way it worked out. It was a split-second decision. I chose what I thought was the lesser of two evils, and I was apparently erroneous in that choice. And that's just the way it goes. So go ahead and drop your own personal story down into the comments. Having that sort of personal idea in your head will help bring to life the conflicts within these two stories and make the reading more meaningful to you. Remember, guys, the greatest trick you can pull whenever you're reading something that seems foreign, particularly if the vocabulary is difficult or the characters seem foreign, or even the conflicts seem like nothing you'll ever have to deal with, is to be able to empathize and put yourself in that place, is to make it meaningful for you. I think if you look around at the world that we're heading into, our ability to generate meaning for ourselves is going to be pretty darn important. Because if we're unable to do that, then we'll simply have to accept the meanings that are generated for us by others who don't necessarily have our own best interests at heart. So that's something to keep in mind as we proceed. Okay, so some questions you can use as like starters for the quick write. Like, think about, would you trust a friend with your life? Think about, which is the stronger emotion? Is it love or is it jealousy? And then finally, how completely can you really know a person? How much do you truly trust that person? My wife and I have been married for 5 years now. We've been together in one form or another for over 10. I've known her since 1997. It took me 10 years to actually get around to asking her out because reasons. But I feel like I know her pretty well. But would I really trust her with my life? Yeah, I think I would. She's someone that I have seen put my own interests before hers enough times that I have absolutely nothing but faith in her as a human being. Do you have someone like that in your life? Do you think you could have someone like that in your life? Because when I was in high school, I sure as heck did not think that was a possibility. So these are some ideas to maybe get you into your written response. Like I said before, drop them down in the comments. It'll at least make for something a little more engaging than all of us being sequestered in our own little silos here. Okay, so it's interesting when we put someone on trial today, like that word has its root in some pretty barbaric medieval practices, some pretty horrific medieval practices. If you think about it, a trial is like people talk about it in terms of like their trials and tribulations, something you suffer through. I didn't, perhaps I was naive once again when I was a kid, but I never really thought about the idea of, isn't it weird that our idea of justice would, in its very words, require the idea of suffering, of pain. When I had to go to teen court, I really understood what that pain was as I sat in front of a jury of my peers who were going to determine what my outcome was going to be. And I had to tell my story about how I wasn't drinking at a party where there was a bunch of alcohol. And they were all like, yeah, right. So yeah. And plus, I hated my peers. It was just a bad situation, all things together. But the root of the term trial, like I said, goes back to the Middle Ages. All right, back in the day, they used to determine someone's guilt or innocence based on like some horrific suffering that they had to go through. Now, you guys have probably heard about these in terms of like witch trials, where we could determine if someone was a witch by like throwing them in the pond. And if they drowned, well, they weren't a witch. But if they floated, they were definitely a witch. And then we got to kill them by hanging or burning them at the stake, whatever the situation was for that environment. But that wasn't the only type of trial that someone could undergo. In the time of chivalry with knights in combat, the idea of a trial by combat was a real thing, where if you were accused of some violation of the law, you could request a trial by combat, wherein you could face your accuser on like the open field with a weapon, and whoever God let win was the one who was right. Like these were the ideas that people believed in terms of determining someone's guilt or someone's innocence. It wasn't based on, legal arguments or precedent or evidence or witnesses. It was based on, can you endure this suffering? And that idea still shows up in the fact that we call them trials to this day. Okay, so last thing we're going to get into here is just some of the trickier vocabulary that pops up in the story. Now remember, a lot of these words are going to have multiple meanings. So if the definition I'm talking about here doesn't match up with the definition that you have for that word when you hear it in your head, that's okay. Words can have multiple meanings. And just make sure that you're using the context of the story in order to help you figure out what the word means if it's a trickier one. So we'll break it down. There's some here that are going to be fairly obvious, but just keep in mind that we're all coming at these stories from different places. So I just put down everything that I thought would be a tricky word. If I missed some, don't hesitate to Google or email me or shoot me a text or on the contact me on Microsoft Teams, I should say, or leave a question in the comments. But let's go ahead and get to it. So first term we're going to talk about is impartial. Now, anyone who's had any type of experience with the criminal justice system, or at least has watched TV shows in that, knows what that means. It means that, like, in theory, the people who judge us are not supposed to be partial. They're not supposed to be biased. They're supposed to be free from pre-existing notions about our guilt or innocence so that they can decide that based on the evidence that is presented. Okay, so emanate just means to come forth, to come from, all right? When you talk about in the sentence example, we heard the sound emanate from the band room, then you know that the sound came from the band room. It's just a fancy way of saying came. Okay, dire. Now, dire is just dreadful, terrible. Breaking the rules can have dire consequences, the example sentence. It's just, it's serious. All right? It sometimes means even respected. In Shakespeare, you'll sometimes find people referring to the king in terms of the dread king. This idea of danger eliciting respect and fear at the root of power. All of these ideas come together in that term, dire. Okay, another couple of terms that we're going to pop up that we should probably know. Fervent just means great intensity or passion. a fervent believer, somebody who truly, truly believes their faith and practices their faith. They're not somebody who just goes to church on Sunday and then does what they want the other 6 days of the week. This is somebody who drank the Kool-Aid, somebody whose heart is in that. Now, novel, this is one of those double meaning words. We're not talking about the book or long story here. We're talking about something that's new, something that's unusual. So when Nirvana hit in 1993, they had a novel sound. Everybody was still listening to Michael Jackson albums, and then this grunge band from Seattle playing like slowed down primitive rock. That was new, and that shocked people's ears. And then after everything became derivative and imitative of that Nirvana sound, along comes ska, and it becomes incredibly popular because with its bright, perky horns and guitars, it has, again, this novel, new sound. Okay, another couple to keep coming at you. Imperious. Now, this can mean commanding. Here they talk about as domineering, overpowering, someone who's, this is the teacher who doesn't feel the need to discuss rules with their students. This is the leader that doesn't feel that their power comes from the people. This is someone who believes that the power comes from themselves. And it's the parent who says, because I said so. All right, presume. That just means to assume or to take for granted. If you're doing your geometry, it is the given. All right. So it's just to take it as fact. All right. Let's keep it rolling. Okay, so semi-barbaric. This is how they describe the king in the first story. This is a loaded term, all right? You got to understand this book was written, this short story I should say, was written in the 1800s. This is a loaded term. The term barbarism or barbarian was originally used by the ancient Romans to refer to all people who were not of the Roman Empire. It is still a dog whistly term to this day that you'll find used by white supremacists who don't actually understand that actually a lot of the Roman Empire wasn't white. In fact, a lot of the Roman emperors weren't white, but that's something that white supremacists, for obvious reasons, tend to ignore. And here I think it's being used in that culturally loaded term. This is a story that the way the author tells us that this is a non-white society in polite terms is to refer to it as semi-barbaric. And it's based on the assumption that this Roman, and you can read the author's intent as Roman meaning white, society is enlightened and is superior. And so his way of discussing this fictional society as something else is to call it semi-barbaric with all of those different connotations that we just talked about there. All right. And going back to Romeo and Juliet, it is a little bit of an oxymoron because how can you be semi-barbaric? How can you be half barbaric? How can you be half civilized and half not? It's almost a joke in and of itself. Okay, the term barley corn. So that's a unit of measurement based on the length of grain, as it says here. It could be a reference to not just British folk songs, but also poetry and an ill-fated character, John Barleycorn. Also in some poetry, it's a shorthand term for whiskey that usually brings about ruination of a person. So all of that loaded in that particular term. Choisterers is just a fancy word for somebody who's in the choir. All right, so if I'm preaching to the choisterers, I'm just preaching to the choir. All right. Moiety. Now here they're not talking about the portion. Once again, this is another reference back to the idea of barbarism, to the idea of that which is not civilized in all of the loaded terms that comes with. Okay, so the story begins. In the very olden time, there lived a semi-barbaric king whose ideas, though somewhat polished and sharpened by the progressiveness of the distant Latin neighbors, were still large, florid, and untrammeled, as became the half of him which was barbaric. He was a man of exuberant fancy, and withal of an authority so irresistible that at his will he turned his varied fancies into facts. He was greatly given to self-communing, and when he and himself agreed upon anything, the thing was done. When every member of his domestic and political systems moved smoothly in its appointed course, his nature was bland and genial. But whenever there was a little hitch, or some of his orbs got out of their orbits, he was blander and more genial still, for nothing pleased him so much as to make the crooked straight and crush down the uneven places. So our story begins, it's a typical fairy tale setting, not a specific time, not a specific place. All we know is that it's a society that is foreign to our own in a time that was long ago. It might as well be a galaxy far away for all our purposes. But we do get some key characterization for one of the fundamental characters here in this description of the semi-barbaric king. All right. He's a man who is half civilized, half not civilized. But he's a man of power. So much so that whatever he wants, whatever his fantasy is, he has the power and authority to make it real. All right. He takes his fantasy and turns it into facts. And what does he consult before he makes his fantasy facts? Only himself. He is an authority. He is a god unto himself. No one has the ability to check him or his power. And if things go smoothly, he's a happy, nice guy. But interestingly, if things start to get messed up, he becomes even happier and even nicer, because he doesn't see it as a problem. He sees it as an opportunity for him to fix things so that this problem doesn't come up again. And then he will use that unchecked power of his to fix it, no matter who gets smashed in the process. Among the borrowed notions by which his barbarism had become educated was that of the public arena, in which, by exhibitions of manly and beastly valor, the minds of his subjects were refined and cultured. So, entertainment in his time, like it is in our own, as it was in ancient Rome, was used to shape the thinking of the masses. So, if he did gladiatorial combat, the stories that were put out there for the gladiators to enact were designed to teach the public who was watching the combat a meaningful lesson that he felt was true. That's the level of control that he had. And in terms of beastly valor, this is a nod to ancient Roman times, in particular the persecution of Christians, wherein the beastly valor that was on display was the Romans feeding Christians to hungry lions in the Colosseum. And at that point, what was being taught to the Roman citizens was, look at these followers of a false god. Where is their God if a lion can devour them in front of you? So he uses the entertainment and the spectacle of the Colosseum in order to communicate his morality to the population. He doesn't have to give a speech. He just has to put on this show. But even here, the exuberant and barbaric fancy asserted itself. The arena of the king was built, not to give the people an opportunity of hearing the rhapsodies of dying gladiators, nor to enable them to view the inevitable conclusion of conflict between religious opinions in the hungry jaws, but for purposes far better adapted to widen and develop the mental energies of the people. This vast amphitheater, with its encircling galleries, its mysterious vaults, and its unseen passages, was an agent of poetic justice, in which crime was punished, or virtue was rewarded by the decrees of an impartial and incorruptible chance. So the king, and I think it would be safe to argue the mad king, in this society doesn't put on the gladiatorial fights, doesn't feed the religious dissidents to lions. He uses his Colosseum to determine innocence or guilt. And not by the trial by combat that we talked about earlier. He determines innocence or guilt based on chance. He's actually a lot closer to the Joker in The Dark Knight, allowing his fate to be determined when he comes up with Two-Face in the coin flip. 50-50 chance. And the way Two-Face then goes on to determine all of the people he kills, a 50-50 chance. That's the reasoning that the king in this story has hit upon as the way of determining who is good and who is bad. So when a subject was accused of a crime of sufficient importance to interest the king, public notice was given that on an appointed day, the fate of the accused person would be decided in the king's arena, a structure which well deserved its name, for although its form and plan were borrowed from afar, its purpose emanated solely from the brain of this man, who, every barleycorn a king, knew no tradition to which he owed more allegiance than pleased his fancy, and who engrafted upon every adopted form of human thought and action the rich growth of his barbaric idealism. And so the king designs this arena specifically to teach the lesson he believes is true for the world. And the only person who's responsible for it is the king. The only person who probably understands it the way he wants it to be understood is the king. But he is the one who determines what this arena is used for. And so in capital cases, in cases that are bad enough to come to his attention, this is how he determines someone's innocent or someone's guilty. When all the people had assembled in the galleries, and the king, surrounded by his court, sat up on his throne of royal state on one side of the arena, he gave a signal, and a door beneath him opened, and the accused subject stepped out into the amphitheater. Directly opposite him, on the other side of the enclosed space, were two doors, exactly alike and side by side. It was the duty and the privilege of the person on trial to walk directly to those doors and open one of them. He could open either door he pleased. He was subject to no guidance or influence, but that of the aforementioned impartial and incorruptible chance. If he opened the one, there came out a hungry tiger, the fiercest and most cruel that could be produced, which immediately sprang upon him and tore him to pieces as a punishment for his guilt. The moment that the case of the criminal was thus decided, sad, doleful iron bells clanged, and great wails went up from the hired mourners posted on the outer rim of the arena. And the vast audience, with bowed heads and downcast hearts, wended slowly their homeward way, mourning greatly that one so young and fair, or so old and respected, should have merited so dire a fate. So, if you choose in this arena, when you walk out from underneath the king and you face the two doors, if you choose the wrong door, you die by tiger. Bad way to go. But the king, with his moral instruction, produces what he feels is the appropriate sentiment in his people, one of mourning and one of sadness, so much so that he's hired mourners, and he's arranged that the sad church bells will ring, and that everything will communicate the sadness at the loss of human life, as decided by what they call incorruptible, impartial, unbiased, random chance. But if the accused person opened the other door, there came forth from it a lady, the most suitable to his years and station that his majesty could select among his fair subjects. And to this lady he was immediately married as a reward for his innocence. It mattered not that he might already possess a wife and family, or that his affections might be engaged upon an object of his own selection. The king allowed no such subordinate arrangements to interfere with his great scheme of retribution and reward. The exercises, as in the other instance, took place immediately and in the arena. Another door opened beneath the king, and a priest, followed by a band of choristers and dancing maidens, blowing joyous airs on golden horns and treading a measure, advanced to where the pair stood side by side, and the wedding was promptly and cheerily solemnized. Then the gay brass bells rang forth their merry peals, and people shouted glad hurrahs, and the innocent man, preceded by children strewing flowers on his path, led his bride to his home. So if you're lucky, if you're Innocent, according to chance, you open up the other door and there's a woman suitable to your age and place in life, who you immediately have to marry in front of everyone. And then there is a joyous celebration. If you're already married, that doesn't matter, because the king's justice is more important than your pre-existing marriage. You already have a family, doesn't matter. You're getting married today in front of everyone, and we will celebrate your innocence as determined, once again, by impartial, random chance. This was the king's semi-barbaric method for administering justice. Its perfect fairness is obvious. The criminal could not know out of which door would come the lady. He opened either he pleased, without having the slightest idea whether in the next instant he was about to be devoured or married. On some occasions the tiger came out of one door, and on some out of the other. The decisions of his tribunal were not only fair, they were positively determinate. The accused person was instantly punished if he found himself guilty, and, if innocent, was rewarded on the spot, whether he liked it or not. There was no escape from judgments or the king's arena. So, in the king's mind, this is perfect justice, because the accused determines his innocence or his guiltiness based on the choice that is made. And there's no messy appeals. There's no, but hey, this wasn't fair, because the outcome is guaranteed and final, and nothing can change that outcome. The institution was a fairly popular one. When the people gathered together on one of the great trial days, they never knew whether they were coming to witness a bloody slaughter or a hilarious wedding. This element of uncertainty lent an interest to the occasion which it could not otherwise have attained. Thus the masses were entertained and pleased, and the thinking part of the community could bring no charge of unfairness against the plan, for did not the accused person have the whole matter in his own hands? So there you have it. Not only does this entertain the people, it's the first reality TV show, but it educates them in terms of what the king views as true about justice in the world, and no one can argue that it's unfair because it's totally random. And isn't that the same thing as fair? This semi-barbaric king had a daughter as blooming as his most florid fancies, with a soul as fervent and imperious as his own. As is usual in such cases, she was the apple of his eye, and was loved by him above all humanity. Among his courtiers was a young man of that fineness of blood and lowness of station common to the conventional heroes of romance who love royal maidens. This royal maiden was well satisfied with her lover, for he was handsome and brave to a degree unsurpassed in all the kingdom, and she loved him with an ardor that had enough of the barbarism to make it exceedingly warm and strong. This love affair moved on happily for many months, until one day the king happened to discover its existence. He did not hesitate or waver in regard to his duty in the premises. The youth was immediately cast into prison, and a day was appointed for his trial in the king's arena. This, of course, was an especially important occasion, and His Majesty, as well as all the people, was greatly interested in the workings and development of this trial. So, here we start to encounter the rising action. The king has a daughter who, like the king, likes to do her own thing, and she decides that her own thing is a member of the king's court who is a brave, handsome, perfect man by all accounts, except that he's below her in station. And so despite the fact that he might be the sort of son that the king would like his daughter to marry, his inferior station makes their love inappropriate. And so when the king discovers their love affair, he follows his own rules. He immediately throws the boy into prison to await his trial. And when this trial comes about, it is the trial of the century, because the people and the king can't wait to see whether this kid will be innocent or dead. Never before had such a case occurred. Never before had the subject dared to love the daughter of a king. In after years, such things became commonplace enough, but then they were, to no slight degree, novel and startling. So in this kingdom, this is the first time anything like this has ever happened. Later on, it's interesting to point out that apparently this became pretty normal for royalty to marry commoners, but here it was the first case. The tiger cages of the kingdom were searched for the most savage and relentless beasts, from which came the fiercest monster that might be selected for the arena. And the ranks of maiden youth and beauty throughout the land were carefully surveyed by competent judges, in order that he, young man, might have a fitting bride in case that fate did not determine for him a different destiny. Of course, everybody knew that the deed with which the accused was charged had been done. He had loved the princess, and neither he, she, nor anyone else thought of denying the fact. But the king would not think of allowing any fact of this kind to interfere with the workings of the tribunal, in which he took such great delight and satisfaction. No matter how the affair turned out, the youth would be disposed of, and the king would take an aesthetic pleasure in watching the course of events, which would determine whether or not the young man had done wrong in allowing himself to love the princess. So the beauty of it is the king gets to find out whether this kid is quote unquote innocent or guilty. He doesn't have to get his hands dirty, but one way or the other, this kid's taken care of and he's going to stop messing around with the king's daughter. The appointed day arrived, and from far and near the people gathered and thronged the great galleries of the arena, and crowds, unable to gain admittance, massed themselves against the outside walls. The king and his court were in their places opposite the twin doors, those faithful portals so terrible in their similarity. So the big day comes. It is standing room only with a crowd outside, and everybody can't wait to see which door gets opened. All was ready. The signal was given. The door beneath the royal party opened, and the lover of the princess walked into the arena. Tall, beautiful, fair, his appearance was greeted with a low hum of admiration and anxiety. Half the audience had not known so grand a youth had lived among them. No wonder the princess loved him. What a terrible thing for him to be there. As the youth advanced into the arena, he turned, as the custom was, to bow to the king. But he did not think at all of that royal personage. His eyes were fixed upon the princess, who sat to the right of her father. Had it not been for the moiety of barbarism in her nature, it is probable that the lady would not have been there, but her intense and fervid soul would not allow her to be absent on an occasion in which she was so terribly interested. From the moment that the decree had gone forth, that her lover should decide his fate in the king's arena, she had thought of nothing, night or day, but this great event, and the various subjects connected with it. Possessed of more power, influence, and force of character than anyone who had ever before been interested in such a case, she had done what no other person had done. She had possessed herself of the secret of the doors. She knew in which of the two rooms that lay behind those doors stood the cage of the tiger with its open front, and in which waited the lady. Through these thick doors, heavily curtained with skins on the inside, it was impossible that any noises or suggestion should come from within to the person who should approach and raise the latch on one of them. But gold and the power of a woman's will had brought the secret to the princess. So the big day comes, the beautiful man comes forward, and as is the custom, he bows to the royal box, but instead of looking at the king out of respect, his eyes are fixed upon the daughter, the princess that he loves and that loves him. And the princess has used her power and influence and womanly wiles to find out the secret. The princess knows which door has the tiger and which door has the lady. And so he's looking for a clue. And not only did she know in which room stood the lady ready to emerge, all blushing and radiant should her door be opened, but she knew who the lady was. It was one of the fairest and loveliest of damsels of the court who had been selected as a reward of the accused youth, should he be proved innocent of the crime of aspiring to one so far above him. And the princess hated her. Often she had seen, or imagined that she had seen, this fair creature throwing glances of admiration upon the person of her lover, and sometimes she thought that these glances were perceived and even returned. Now and then she had seen them talking together. It was but for a moment or two, but much can be said in a brief space. It may have been on the most unimportant topics, but how could she know that? The girl was lovely, but she had dared to raise her eyes to the beloved one of the princess, and with all the intensity of the savage blood transmitted through her long lines of holy barbaric ancestors, she hated the woman who blushed and trembled behind that silent door. So, plot twist, not only does the princess know where the lady is, she knows who the lady is, and she hates her. In fact, she's jealous of her. And she doesn't want her man to be with her. When her lover turned and looked at her, and his eyes met hers as she sat there paler and whiter than anyone in that vast ocean of anxious faces about her, he saw, by the power of quick perception which is given to those whose souls are one, that she knew behind which door crouched the tiger, and behind which stood the lady. He had expected her to know it. He understood her nature, and his soul was assured that she would never rest until she had made plain to herself this thing, hidden to all other lookers-on, even to the king. The only hope for the youth in which there was any element of certainty was based upon the success of the princess in discovering this mystery, and the moment he looked upon her, he saw she had succeeded, as in his soul he knew she would succeed. So not only does the princess know behind which door is the lady and the tiger, but now the accused knows she knows. It was that his quick and anxious glance asked the question, which? It was as plain to her as if he had shouted it from where he stood. There was not an instant to be lost. The question was asked in a rash. It must be answered in another. So he asks her, without saying it, which door do I choose? Because he knows, she knows the inside information. Her right arm lay on the cushioned parapet before her. She raised her hand and made a slight, quick movement towards the right. No one but her lover saw her. Every eye but his was fixed upon the man in the arena. He turned, and with a firm and rapid step, he walked across the empty space. Every heart stopped beating, every breath was held, every eye was fixed immovably upon that man. Without the slightest hesitation, he went to the door on the right and opened it. Now, the point of the story is this. Did the tiger come out of the door, or did the lady? The more we reflect upon this question, the harder it is to answer. It involves a study of the human heart, which leads us through devious mazes of passion, out of which it's difficult to find our way. Think of it, fair reader, not as the decision of the question depended upon yourself, but upon that hot-blooded, semi-barbaric princess, her soul at white heat beneath the combined fires of despair and jealousy. She had lost him, but who should have him? So this is where the author subverts our expectations. We all read a short story expecting resolution. We come to the climax, and the story stops. And then the author asks us, what happens next? And it's an interesting question. He tells us that we shouldn't look at it from our own personal point of view, but we should try to assume the perspective of this hot-blooded barbarian princess. But come on, it's 2020. I think we know that hot-blooded barbarian princess or slightly warm-blooded 42-year-old English teacher, we're all more or less the same. So I think it's okay to apply this question to yourself. What would you do? What door would you have indicated? What do you think she indicated, and what does that tell you about what you think about humanity, about people at their most basic and natural? It's an interesting question. How often in her waking hours and in her dreams had she startled, wild in horror, covered her face with her hands as she thought of her lover opening the door on the other side which waited the cruel fangs of the tiger. But how much oftener had she seen him at the other door? How in her grievous reveries had she gnashed her teeth and torn her hair when she saw his start of rapturous delight as he opened the door to the lady? How her soul had burned in agony when she had seen him rush to meet the woman with her flushing cheek and sparkling eye of triumph. When she had seen him lead her forth, his whole frame rekindled with the joy of recovered life. When she had heard the glad shouts from the multitude and the wide ringing of the happy bells. When she had seen the priest with his joyous followers advance to the couple and make them man and wife before her very eyes. And when she had seen them walk away together on the path of flowers, followed by the tremendous shouts of the hilarious multitude, in which her one despairing shriek was lost and drowned. So the author seems to have his opinion. He seems to believe that the princess's jealousy will overpower her love. At least that's the implication if we go from these two paragraphs. The paragraph about the tiger being relatively short and undetailed compared to the pain that she can imagine, the real horror, not of seeing the man she loves devoured by a tiger, but of seeing the man she loves marry someone who isn't her. Would it not be better for him to die at once and go await her in the blessed regions of semi-barbaric futurity? And yet, that awful tiger, those shrieks, that blood. Her decision had been indicated in an instant, but it had been made after days and nights of anguished deliberation. She had known she would be asked, and she had decided what she would answer. And without the slightest hesitation, she had moved her hand to the right. The question of her decision is not one to be lightly considered, and it is not for me to presume to set myself up as the one person able to answer it. So I leave it with all of you. Which came out of the open door? The lady or the tiger? All right, I want you guys to pause it and take a break. Go ahead and post your answer and your reasons why in the comment section, and we'll see what you think. Now, this second story that we're going to get into is a much shorter, much easier story. It's got pictures and illustrations that I stole without regard to copyright infringement. But I hope you're able to see beyond just the obvious parallels here. And then maybe we can talk about the deeper meaning that goes beyond not just the question that's being asked about us as readers and our view of humanity, but maybe we can discuss a fairly interesting answer to that question that's given by the subsequent short story, Cinnamon, by Neil Gaiman. Cinnamon was a princess a long time ago in a small, hot country where everything was very old. Her eyes were pearls, which gave her great beauty, but meant she was blind. Her world was the color of pearls, pale white and pink and softly glowing. Cinnamon did not talk. So here, once again, we have the similar setting. Character, instead of being focused on the king, is focused on the princess, this girl Cinnamon. And unlike our hot-blooded barbarian princess, this princess is both beautiful and deformed. Instead of normal human eyes, her eyes are pearls. And this influences the way she sees the world, or does not see the world. She sees only white and pink and the shape of things. And she is unable or unwilling to speak. Her father and mother, the Raja and the Rani, offered a room in the palace, a field of stunted mango trees, a portrait of the Rani's aunt executed on hard wood in enamels, and a green parrot to any person who could get Cinnamon to talk. The mountains ringed the country on one side and the jungle on the other, and few and far came the people to try to teach Cinnamon to speak. So the princess's loving parents even offer a reward to any teacher who can get their daughter to talk. It might sound odd to us, but you have to understand, in this tiny country where there is the king and apparently all else who live in abject poverty, having your own mango field, having your own room in the palace, even having your own bird of leisure in the form of a parrot. All of these things, and let's not forget, beautiful artwork. All of these things must have seemed a very great enticement to become a teacher. But come they did. They stayed in the room in the palace and cultivated the field of mango trees and fed the parrot and admired the portrait of the Rani's aunt, who was quite a celebrated beauty in her day, although she was now old and crabbed and pinched with age and disappointment. And eventually they went away, frustrated and cursing the silent little girl. One day, a tiger came to the palace. He was huge and fierce, a nightmare in black and orange, and he moved like a god through the world, which is how tigers move. And the people were afraid. "There's nothing to be frightened of," said the Raja. "Very few tigers are man-eaters." "But I am," said the tiger. And the people were much amazed at this, although it did nothing whatsoever to quell their fear. "You might be lying," said the Raja. "I might be," said the tiger, "but I am not. Now I am here to teach the girl cub to talk." The Raja consulted with the Rani, and despite the urgings of the Rani's aunt, who was of the opinion that the tiger should be driven out of the city with brooms and sharp sticks, the tiger was shown to the room in the palace and given the enamel painting and the deed to the mango field, and would also have been given the green parrot had it not squawked and flown up to the rafters, where it stayed and refused to come down. So unlike our previous story, the princess has no lover, has no forbidden romance. She simply has her inability to speak and the inability of teachers to get her to speak. When, amazingly, this magical tiger appears who can talk and says he will teach her how to speak. Cinnamon was shown to the tiger's room. "There was a young lady from Riga," squawked the parrot from high in the rafters, "who went for a ride on a tiger. They came back from the ride with the lady inside and a smile on the face of the tiger." Although, in the interests of historical and literary accuracy, I am obliged to point out that the parrot actually quoted from another poem, much older and a little longer, with ultimately a similar message. "There," said the Rani's aunt, "even the bird knows." "Leave me with the girl," said the tiger. And reluctantly, the Raja and the Rani's aunt and the palace staff left the beast with Cinnamon. She pushed her fingers into his fur and felt his hot breath on her face. The tiger put Cinnamon's hand into his. "Pain," said the tiger, and extended one needle-sharp claw into Cinnamon's palm. It pierced her soft brown skin, and a bead of bright blood welled up. Cinnamon whimpered. "Fear," said the tiger, and it began to roar, starting so quiet that you could scarcely hear it. then working its way up to a purr, and then to a quiet roar like a distant volcano, and then to a roar so loud that the palace walls shook. Cinnamon trembled. "Love," said the tiger, and with his rough red tongue it licked the blood from Cinnamon's palm and licked her soft brown face. "Love," whispered Cinnamon in a voice wild and dark from disuse. And the tiger opened its mouth and grinned like a hungry god, which is how tigers grin. The moon was full that night. It was bright morning when the child and the tiger walked out of the room together. Cymbals crashed and bright birds sang, and Cinnamon and the tiger walked towards the Rani and the Raja, who sat at one end of the throne room being fanned with palm fronds by elderly retainers. The Rani's aunt sat in a corner of the room, drinking tea disapprovingly. "Can she talk yet?" asked the Rani. "Why don't you ask her?" growled the tiger. "Can you talk?" the Raja asked Cinnamon. The girl nodded. "Ha!" cackled the Rani's aunt. "She can no more talk than she can lick her own backbone." "Hush," said the Raja to the Rani's aunt. "I can talk," said Cinnamon. "I think I always could." "Then why didn't you?" asked her mother. "She's not talking now," muttered the Rani's aunt, wagging one stick-like finger. "That tiger is throwing his voice." "Can no one get that woman to stop talking?" asked the Raja of the room. "Easier to stop him than to start him," said the tiger, and he dealt with the matter. And Cinnamon said, "Why not?" "Because I had nothing to say." "And now?" asked her father. "And now the tiger has told me of the jungle, of the chattering of the monkeys and the smell of the dawn and the taste of the moonlight and the noise a lake full of flamingos makes when it takes to the air," she said. "And what I have to say is this: I'm going with the tiger." "You cannot do this thing," said the Raja. "I forbid it." "It is difficult," said Cinnamon, "to forbid a tiger anything it wants." And the Raja and the Rani, after giving the matter a little consideration, agreed that this was so. "And besides," said the Rani, "she'll certainly be happier there." "But what about the room and the palace and the mango grove and the parrot and the picture of the Rani's late aunt?" asked the Raja, who felt that there was a place for practicality in the world. "Give them to the people," said the tiger. And so an announcement was made that the people of the city were now the proud owners of a parrot, a portrait, and a mango grove, and that the Princess Cinnamon could speak, but she would be leaving them for a while to further her education. A crowd gathered in the town square, and soon the door of the palace opened, and the tiger and the child came out. The tiger walked slowly through the crowd, with the little girl on his back, holding tightly to his fur. And soon they both were swallowed up by the jungle, which is how a tiger leaves. So in the end, nobody was eaten, save only the Rani's elderly aunt, who was gradually replaced in the popular mind by the portrait of her, which hung in the town square, and thus was forever beautiful and young. And that's the end of the story. So, in a way, similar characters, similar setting, different conflict, but we're still kind of left with this question about what happens next. And I think for all of us, an important set of instructions being given us by this author about what should happen for us next. Cinnamon's not the only one in the world who's ever felt like she couldn't speak because she didn't have anything to say. And then how did she gain the power of speech? Our author tells us. She experiences pain and fear and love. And after learning about these things and about learning about the world, she's ready to go out into the world with her voice. Now, this is a children's story, and I read this story to my 3-year-old son. He's my kid. I can do what I want. A lot of people probably would not. He is now of an age where he's very troubled by the fact that the Rani's aunt was eaten by the tiger. He doesn't like that. But I think that that happens for a reason. And it goes back to the short story that we read before. Now, with my freshmen this year, we talked about logical fallacies, and one of those was what's called a false dichotomy, or false choices. You're either with us or you're against us, politicians will argue. You're either on my team or you're my enemy. That's not really true, though. You could agree with someone on some points, or you could disagree with them on other points, but you're not all for them or all against them. You can be in between. That possibility does exist, despite what politicians and the popular media will have you believe. The choice between the lady and the tiger as a construct for understanding humanity is a false choice. I think that's what the author of this children's story is trying to get us to understand. It is not innocence or guilt. It's both. It is the lady and the tiger in life. And meaningful life, life that is worth talking about, involves pain and fear and love. And the Rani's aunt, who, though she was once beautiful, has grown into someone crabbed with age and disappointment, so much so that she cannot even see the miracle of the talking tiger or the princess's acquired speech and find happiness, is destroyed by the bitterness that's inside of her. Yeah, the tiger eats her, but the tiger only had to eat her because she could not keep her bitter words in her mouth. She had to spit them out to the point where the king asked somebody to shut her up, and the tiger was more than happy to volunteer. And that brings us to the conclusion on this last page. What's left over of the Rani's aunt? Her bitterness, her pain, her fear, all that fades away. And the only thing that's left is her beauty. And I think that's something that's instructive for us, especially in these times in which we're living. We are all going to experience, in a multitude of different forms, pain and fear and beauty and love. And if we allow that pain and that fear to consume us, we will be destroyed by it. But what lasts, what lives in people's memories, what will be here forever, are the beautiful things that we create or the beautiful things that we are. So somewhere in that, there is a lesson that I desperately want every single one of you to understand. I try to explain at length to my 3-year-old, though he's not quite sure Dad's altogether right about it. So let me know what you think. Post something in the comments, shoot me an email. I'm going to keep, I think, trying to do these enrichment activities where I share stories that I think are cool or talk about ways to write that are important. And as long as you guys keep viewing the videos, you'll have something, I hope, that's at least a little bit educational going on in your lives beyond all the noise that's out there in the world right now. This is my last official enrichment activity, so if you are going to check out after this one because you're tired of listening to my voice after 14 accumulated hours of Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth. I don't blame you, but one way or the other, if you keep coming back or if you don't, I hope you stay safe out there. I hope that your family is okay, and I hope I see you guys on the other side. Take care.